Good afternoon, my name is Clara Wheeler, and today I'll be talking about the reproductive ecology and breeding migration patterns of the Cascades frog in the Trinity Alps Wilderness here in California. The Cascade frog is a medium-sized frog that occurs and reproduces in ephemeral and permanent ponds or streams. Its distribution ranges from western and central Washington to northern California along the Cascade Range. There have been significant population declines. It's currently a state species of special concern, and there have been dramatic declines in the Lassen region, which we'll be hearing about from John Stead later on. So our objective was to examine aspects of the reproductive ecology and breeding migration patterns of Rana cascadei. We looked at two different scales. We did a basin-wide study where we examined breeding activity and site fidelity and breeding migration patterns. And we also focused on one specific breeding site. This is Snowmelt Pond. We examined breeding migration patterns, breeding site fidelity of actual individuals, and breeding site arrival time. So our study area was Deep Creek Basin, which is located in the Trinity Alps Wilderness in Trinity County, California. Here's an aerial photo of Deep Creek Basin. It's approximately 3 kilometers square in area, and elevations range from 1,890 to 2,438 meters. This basin has variable aquatic habitat, which includes large wet meadow complexes, which have both lentic and lotic habitat. The lentic habitat are these small ponds within the meadows. We also have a large deep lake, which is Echo Lake, and a larger pond, Snowmelt Pond here, as well as creeks that connect the larger water bodies and the meadow systems. So Snowmelt Pond is the breeding site that we focused on to look at some of the breeding activity in detail. And the reason why we selected this site is because of the seasonal variation in the available habitat at the site. As you can see, in early spring, which is this first photograph here, the pond is completely snow covered. This pond has no springs that feed it or creeks that feed it. It's basically a depression that just gets filled up by snowmelt. By the end of the summer to early fall, the pond dries completely. And so since it dries completely, it doesn't provide any overwintering habitat for these frogs. So the primary function of this pond to the frogs is for breeding activity. So our field methods, the surveys that were conducted for frogs were actually surveys conducted for Justin Garwood's master's thesis research. He did a mark-recapture study on the population of frogs in this basin, and Karen Pope also provided some data of surveys that were conducted at Snowmelt Pond and Echo Lake. We did visual encounter surveys where we searched all aquatic habitat for frogs. Location was recorded, frogs were marked with pit tags, and we took snout to urostyle length and weight measurements. In addition, we did egg mass surveys. These were also visual encounter surveys. We collected data on location, date, and number of egg masses at each site. So in addition to the pit tags, all male frogs at Snowmelt Pond were fitted with these seed bead belts, and this allowed us to identify them in the field without having to capture them every time we observed them at Snowmelt Pond. So now into the results. Here's the photograph of Deep Creek Basin once again, and the areas in red are the 8 sites that were utilized for breeding sites in 2003, 2004, and 2005. Breeding sites range from 1,976 to 2,226 meters in elevation, with straight line distances between nearest neighboring breeding sites ranging from 116 to 532 meters. And that's actually supposed to be mean, not file equals. Because the elevation of breeding sites within the basin varied so much, we wanted to actually look at the relationship between elevation and the date of breeding activity at each site within the basin. And as you would predict, breeding activity occurred earlier at lower elevation sites and later with increasing elevation. Okay, this chart actually has a lot of data, so I'll go over it really slowly. This actually is the duration of breeding activity within the basin for all 3 years. So it includes all the sites within the basin. I only have 4 here. Deep Creek is a lower elevation site, and then the last 3 are higher elevation sites. The position of each line actually corresponds to the amount of snow depth in inches in the month of May. So for example, in 2003, which is this line here, there was approximately 138 inches of snow. For each line, the beginning of the line represents the first egg mass observed, and the end of the line represents the last egg mass that was observed. And as you can see, when you compare 2003 and 2004, 2003 had a higher snowpack, and breeding occurred later at every single site. However, in 2005, breeding occurred earlier in the lower elevation sites because the snowpack was fairly low in the month of May. However, at the higher elevation sites, which are these 3 here, breeding actually occurred later than it had in 2004 and 2003. The reason for this, we believe, is that we had a late snowfall event that occurred in mid-June, and we believe that because of this extra snow, the frogs were delayed in breeding at these higher elevation sites, so it actually extended the breeding duration of activity within the basin. One last thing I wanted to say about this graph is the breeding activity within the entire basin is fairly prolonged. So in 2003, it was 58 days long, in 2004 it was 45, and in 2005 it was 53 days long. However, the breeding activity at each individual site is explosive, and activity occurs over a couple of days to at most a couple of weeks. So for site fidelity, we observed a total of 50 egg masses in 2003, 51 in 2004, and 47 in 2005. And this is within the entire basin, and so productivity is fairly low, even though this population is considered a pretty healthy population. 8 of 12 breeding sites used for reproduction were used in all 3 years. 33 individual ponds were used for reproduction, but only 13 were used in all 3 years, and that's only 6% of available ponds within the basin. And those 13 ponds that were used all 3 years contained 78% of the total number of egg masses for all 3 years. So this indicates that there's breeding site fidelity to not only sites, but individual ponds as well. So for breeding migration, I just wanted to show you some movement paths to and from breeding sites. Here's one, here's another, and here's a third. And as you can see, there are some extensive movements occurring between or to and from breeding sites, but most of the movements are actually fairly local. So for breeding migration, just at snowmelt ponds, these are movement paths to and from snowmelt ponds, and as I said earlier, there are some extensive movements occurring, but most of the movements are occurring between Snowmelt Pond here and Echo Lake here. So I just wanted to go over some extensive movements just to give you a feel for what these frogs are capable of. So here's one female that moved 1,200 meters up to Snowmelt Pond. This female moved 830 meters away from Snowmelt Pond. We recaptured her at Snowmelt Pond, and then she once again left Snowmelt Pond. Here's a similar example, a female that moved 980 meters away from Snowmelt Pond, traveled back up to Snowmelt Pond, and traveled back away from Snowmelt Pond. And these 2 last cases indicate that frogs not only have site fidelity to breeding sites, but also to other sites that provide resources such as summer foraging and or overwintering. And one last example, a male that traveled to Echo Lake and then up to Snowmelt Pond. And just to give you an idea of the terrain that these frogs are traveling and how much we're underestimating their traveling, this is the movement paths for the previous frog here, up to Echo Lake and then over to Snowmelt Pond. but we believe this frog probably traveled up this meadow system, up this creek, up to Echo Lake, and then over to Snowmelt Pond. So we probably are really underestimating the distances these frogs are traveling. So now I'm just going to talk about the movement from Snowmelt Pond to Echo Lake. As I mentioned earlier, most of the movements that are occurring to Snowmelt Pond are from and back to Echo Lake. This photo is Echo Lake and Snowmelt Pond, and the distance between the two water bodies is approximately 200 meters. And post-breeding, the frogs travel back to Echo Lake. And the snowpack along this ridge is variable with season. In 2003 and 2004, Justin Garwood did some radio telemetry on frogs at Echo Lake that traveled to Snowmelt Pond, and he observed them traveling both along the exposed rocks where the snow had already melted, but also underneath the snow. In 2005, this ridge was entirely snow-covered prior to and at the beginning of the breeding season, so frogs were traveling almost completely under the snow. 2 frogs were documented moving from Echo Lake to Snowmelt Pond in a single day, and 3 frogs were documented moving from Snowmelt Pond to Echo Lake in a single day. And this shows us that these frogs are making these movements fairly rapidly, and fairly rapidly over both dry lands and under snow. Here's breeding activity just for Snowmelt Pond. The dashed lines here are water temperature. And as you can see, in 2004, the water temperature was a lot warmer than the other 2 years. Breeding activity occurred earlier in 2004 than 2003 and 2005. In 2005 occurred prior to 2003, but it took a really long time here for that water temperature to rise in 2003. So here's our data on breeding site fidelity. This is data just for males. In 2003, we captured 52 male frogs, 41 in 2004, and 29 in 2005. So of the frogs that we had captured in 2003, 35 returned in 2004, 5 were observed elsewhere, 12 were unaccounted for. In 2005, of the frogs observed in 2004, 21 returned, 10 were observed elsewhere, and 10 were unaccounted for. And these frogs that are unaccounted for here, we're not certain what their fate was. We just know we didn't capture them again. Justin has a very high recapture rate, so we sort of assume that these could be mortalities, but they could also be dispersal from the basin. But with the assumption that these are mortalities, we did a calculation and figured that the percent of known alive frogs that returned in 2004 from 2003 is about 88% and 68% in 2005. One last thing I wanted to note here is these frogs that were observed elsewhere. In 2004, the 5 that were observed elsewhere were observed at Echo Lake. So they actually didn't make the migration over to Snowmelt Pond in that year. In 2005, 8 of these 10 frogs were observed at Echo Lake. They didn't make the movement over to Snowmelt Pond. And we're not quite sure why this is. Echo Lake is one of Karen Pope's research sites where she removed fish in 2003. And so it's possible that this may be a response to that fish removal, but it may also be some other trade-off where the cost of migrating over to Snowmelt Pond exceeds the benefits. 11 frogs were observed at Snowmelt Pond in all 3 years, and in both years, 77% of the males that returned to Snowmelt Pond were last observed at Echo Lake. So most of the frogs traveling to Snowmelt Pond are coming from Echo Lake and using that lake for summer foraging and overwintering habitat. So lastly, we looked at, we wanted to see if there was a correlation or relationship between arrival date and the size of the males. And there was a significant correlation with larger males arriving to the breeding site earlier than later males. So in conclusion, breeding activity occurs later with increasing elevation. Timing of breeding activity is related to snow depth and water temperature. Frogs have fidelity to particular breeding sites and ponds, with most egg masses laid within these ponds. Frogs may migrate long distances to and away from breeding sites. individual frogs have breeding site fidelity, and large males are first to arrive to breeding sites. Before I have time for questions, we also collected some behavioral data, which I wasn't able to incorporate in this talk, but we put together some video footage of some behaviors, and I wanted to play that now. I apologize, there is some anthropomorphism within this film, but frogs are people too. So that is my interpretation. It's not backed up by scientific evidence yet.